we're very delighted to have with us today Torild Gjesvik, who is going to be presenting to us. She is currently a senior lecturer at the University of Oslo. In 2018, she published a book about the Norwegian photographer Knud Knudsen, which of course is very relevant to us today and for this exhibition. And her book was based on her research for her PhD about roads in art. She's also practiced as a freelance art historian, critic, and curator. And all of that has tied in very wonderfully with this exhibition and publication. So her talk today will continue some of the things that Marta began in talking about the picture collection and some of Knud Knudsen's work that is at the picture collection. So Torild's presentation is titled Knud Knudsen, Routes, Roads, and Landscapes. So let's give her a warm welcome. She'll hear us clapping, even if she can't see us.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for inviting me. And I'm really sorry I cannot be with you physically. But it's still a great pleasure to be able to participate via Zoom. So I understand that Marta has already introduced you a little bit to Knud Knudsen. So I will start by saying a few words about the research I've done on Knudsen and sort of how I started my work with Knudsen. And it started with the research project Routes, Roads and Landscapes, Aesthetic Practices en Route 1750 to 2015. We were a group of 8 people who participated in this research project, and we were really interested in studying how roads and infrastructure had impacted the aestheticization of the landscape starting from late 18th century and onwards. And here you see a couple of the publications that we made. I also finished my PhD about roads in art. And when I did my PhD, I studied both paintings, prints, and photographs. And I knew of some of Knud Knudsen's photographs earlier on, but when I started to search for pictures of roads from Norwegian 19th century pictures, then it became very clear that Knud Knudsen's photographs was a very, very rich source, and that he was deeply, deeply fascinated by the new modern landscape and the new infrastructural landscape that sort of was created at the same time as he was taking his photographs. Because during the 19th century, there was being built a lot of new roads in Norway. The railways were being built and so on. And Knud Knudsen traveled all over Norway. And when we look at his photographs, we can really see how he did not only take photographs of the nature that he saw, but that he also was deeply fascinated by these new roads and the infrastructural landscape. So here you can see a couple of examples. So in addition to the roads and railways, he took a lot of photographs of bridges, both old ones and new ones, and also canals and so on. So he was interested in the totality of this infrastructural landscape. Yeah, I just have to look briefly at my at my notes there. Yeah, and in some of his photographs, he also shows us important aspects of his own work, and these are really interesting. So this photograph you see here, taken in 1881, which was a year or so before Knudsen started using dry plates. At this point, he was still using wet plate technology. And here he does not only show us the landscape, but also, how he arrived at this landscape by showing us the road in the foreground. And we see the carriage with a lot of his boxes, probably containing glass plate negatives and all the other equipment he needed. And then in the middle of the picture, you can see his portable darkroom tent that he needed to use at this point in his career. And he probably stopped at this point or at this particular spot in order to take a photograph of the mountain in the background. So this photograph he took just after the one I just showed you. And in this photograph, of course, we don't get a hint of how he actually accessed this particular spot. So it's very interesting to see how he, in some of his photographs, have this element of self-reflection. They also really contain very interesting information about how he worked and how he got around in the landscape. And now for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on one particular landscape. It's a place called Stalheim and Nærøy, the valley Nærøydalen in the western part of Norway. And this is really one of Norway's most iconic landscapes. It early on became much visited area for tourists, and it still is so today. This photograph was taken probably in the late 1880s or early 1890s. So it's quite a late photograph because Knudsen came to this particular area many, many times. So I will show you in a minute some earlier ones. But he came back here several times and really explored the area photographically in a very interesting way. And it's also worth saying and showing to you some earlier pictures of the same area, because before Knudsen took his photograph, this area had been explored by other artists. You can see 3 examples here of earlier paintings and also an example of a print. And as you see, all these artists were interested in the magnificent view over over the valley Nærøydalen. And so was Knudsen in the photograph I just showed you. But I really wanted to see how he explored this area from his first trip to Stalheim. And then we get quite a different impression. And when I explored Knudsen's how he photographed this area, I used this particular document, which has been really, really important in my research. It's Knud Knudsen's sales catalogue, where there are about, I think, 9,000 photographs catalogued in this sales catalogue. And Knudsen was really meticulous in the way he numbered and ordered his photographs. And that's very lucky for us today, because it means that we can actually follow his travel routes really we can almost follow in his footsteps. Which made it possible for me to see and to research how he sort of explored this area from his first trips, and to sort of follow him picture by picture. And here, so I will show you now about 8-9 photographs from this first trip that he made to Stalheim around 1865 to 1870. And here you can see how he really takes photographs as he moves through the landscape. And he uses the road as a kind of axis of orientation, which is really almost in all the pictures he takes from this tour. The road is a part of the landscape. He shows it all the time. And what you can also see is that now he approaches the landscape from the opposite direction. So we don't see this magnificent view. We rather follow the road the other way, upward. And as he travels along the road, he is really interested in sort of exploring this relationship between the landscape and the road. And as you can see, he really turns his camera downwards and is really interested in the sort of the materiality of the road and the landscape. And for example, here you see the curve of the road meeting the waterfall, and in the last picture in this series, the winding road meeting the small river in the valley bottom. Details such as these he really explores here, and it's worth noting that we hardly see the sky at all. So here it's not this magnificent view of the valley that interests him, but other aspects of the landscape. And when he gets to the top, then he sort of turns around and captures the view that we saw in also the earlier paintings. So on the one hand, we see that he was really aware of the earlier picture tradition, and in some of his photographs, he sort of uses or he makes variations over these earlier paintings and compositions. And at other times, he is really experimenting with many different vantage points and kind of exploring in a very free way, which is really interesting to see. I asked myself whether did Knud Knudsen take photographs such as the ones I showed you now? Did he take it for his own pleasure, or did they really sell? And it's difficult to answer because we don't know a lot about which of his pictures sold well and which ones didn't sell well. But consulting travelogues from the same time, it's very interesting to note that the tourists visiting the area, they were also very interested in roads, actually. So there are a lot of comments about roads in travel diaries and travelogues, and also about the experience of traveling these roads. So, for example, the Norwegian cultural historian Bjarne Rogan, he has done research on this topic, and how he says that the tourists, they were not only interested in looking at Norwegian nature, they were also actually very interested in this, the totality of experiencing the Norwegian landscape and traveling through it. And there was this particular technology with the carriole, which you can see an example of here. He calls it, Bjarne Roggan calls it the racing car of the 19th century. And cites, for example, British tourists and how they describe traveling with this particular carriage. So I just had to explain very briefly to you how it worked. It was only for one person at a time, and this carriage has no brakes. And in order to, it's very light, but in order to provide some stability, it was usual to either have a small boy, as you can see here, providing some weight, or you could have luggage behind there to give it some more balance. And then you really just had to trust the horse. So you have these really great descriptions of traveling very, very fast on these curving roads. So I think that it was a common, it was not only Knudsen being interested in the roads, but also the tourists were interested in traveling these roads. And here you see also a late photograph by Knudsen of Stallheimskleiva, where he actually captures the whole of the road installation with, I think it's 14 or 16 hairpin bends. So you have to try to imagine how it was to travel down here with the carriole. And here you see the same photograph, but in a photographic album. I wanted to show you this because I think it gives an interesting glimpse into how Knudsen's photographs were used and how they were spread. And some of Knudsen's business correspondence have survived, and it shows that he had a really extensive network of business connections in both in Europe but also in the States. So I just wanted to end this talk by letting you know that Knudsen actually also traveled to the States, visiting some relatives that had moved to Thor in Iowa. And at the same time, he exhibited at the World's Columbian, I have to check the right, sorry. The Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. And at that exhibition, William Henry Jackson also showed his landscape photographs. So it's really interesting to now have them back together again at the exhibition you've just been seeing. So with that note, I say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Torild. I would love to open up for questions. I know it's a little tricky since she can't see, but I can translate the questions or make sure she can hear them, because this is just really fascinating. Does anyone have any to start? I think I wondered, as you were talking, when he came to the States, Torild, did he photograph the States while he was here, or did he just?
he did take some photographs from Thor, where his relatives lived. I'm not sure if any of them are shown in the exhibition. Are they?
No.
No. It's a kind of handful of photographs, so they're not that many.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to find out more about which photographs he showed at the exhibition in Chicago,
Fair,
but
yeah.
that's been very, very difficult. So I haven't succeeded yet.
Oh, fascinating. Okay. Yeah. Other questions for Torild about? Okay. Yeah. Chip Oscarson is one of our faculty members in Scandinavian Studies. He's getting a microphone now.
I'm just a disembodied voice to you. My question is kind of where you ended. I'd love to hear a little bit more about it. From what I've understood, most of the Knud Knudsen photographs were circulated by his direct sales, either through. But what? When people were buying these photographs, what were they typically buying them for? You've showed a couple collections that it looks like they were in. Those must have come a little bit later. At what point did postcards become important? Was that an important kind of way that these photographs were distributed? I understand that stereoscopic views were used as well, although I don't know that Knud Knudsen ever did the much with stereoscopic photographs. So how were people generally coming across these? What venues did they show up in? I imagine that changed over time as technology developed.
I will try to answer your question. I didn't hear all of it, but I will pick up on the things I heard. First of all, photographs. Postcards. They were starting to be produced in Norway just after Knudsen ended his career in the early 20th century. When Knudsen sold his photographs, they could be either people could buy an album and sort of buy their own photographs to put in the album. They could buy photographs and mount them on sort of cardboard frames. He also sold albums that were already sort of compiled and beforehand, you know. He had an extensive network of places where he sold photographs in commission. For example, hotels and other places where tourists would gather. And I think he was quite a good businessman as well, actually. And he was very aware of competitors. And it's interesting to see how some of the other photographers operating in Norway at the same time, they sometimes make very similar photographs and sort of pick up on each other's photographs in order to sort of position themselves in the market and so on.
Yeah, thank you. He was quite the businessman as well, I think. It seems clear. So, yeah. Good. Other questions? Okay, Marta. We'll see. It's hard. I'm sorry you can't hear very well, Torild. So if you can't hear Marta, Marta, you could even come up here.
I'll do that. I'll come up there.
Hey, Torild.
Hi.
Thanks for your talk. That was wonderful. This is a little bit of a geek to geek question. As you know, we have the Knudsen archive, the business protocolla. How were they helpful for you in your work, or were they kind of rediscovered too late for your work on Knud Knudsen?
I did use them, but I didn't. I haven't been through all of it. But I had a look through some of it, and some of it is quite difficult to read, actually. So I used it mostly in order to get a sense of his business network. And I found that really, really interesting because he had such an extensive network. But it would have been, I mean, a lot of research can be done, I think, you know, if you really go through that correspondence. But I didn't really have the time to do that. And you really need time because, as I say, it's, you know, there are copies on this very, very thin sheets of paper. So it can be really, really tricky to read. And then I believe after I finished my research, yet more correspondence, business correspondence, was found. Isn't that right? With account books and things like that.
Yeah. I should give some context here that I said earlier in my presentation that there was not a lot of written material, but we do have a stack of correspondence books from the business. So they're not like anything like, ooh, today I went there and I photographed. They're more like sending 4 images to, but yeah, I imagine that for you, like looking at numbers and actual routes, they could have been useful. And when the picture collection bought the archive from Knudsen in 1974, that was just the first part of it. We got a second batch that they found in the 90s, and then even in 2018, one of the descendants of the business owners came in with another box that they found in a garage, I think. So, and that actually, I think, had the portrait that you, is that right? Was that the portrait on your book that they found in that batch as well?
No, that is a relative in Odda, Knudsen's birthplace. He had that one.
So things keep like appearing and popping up, and we find stuff all the time, which is super exciting. Yeah. Thank you, Torild.
Yeah, Elizabeth, why don't you just come up? So Dr. Elizabeth Hutchinson is coming up to ask you a question as well, Torild.
I'm so happy to see you again, Torild, and I'm so sorry you're not here with us. It would be really wonderful to have you see this Utah landscape with us. My question is about railroads versus carriage roads, because the exhibition has a section on railroads, and you know, one of the things about American railroads, at least, is that they're very, very straight. And in fact, they completely ignore the landscape. So there's a wonderful Haynes here where he's built a bridge to just avoid having to deal with a valley. I don't know if Knudsen took many photographs of railroads, but do you see a difference in the history of representations of the Norwegian landscape between attitudes towards railroads and towards carriage roads?
This is really interesting, and it makes me want to study that further, because I had to choose, and I just chose to concentrate on roads. I've also seen, I mean, he did take quite a lot of railroad photographs, especially of the stretch from Bergen to Voss, which was built quite early in his, quite close to where he was working in Bergen. I sort of tried to see them in my mind's eye now, and I think you might be right that they sort of because they are straighter. It doesn't mean that they don't curve every now and then, but I have to look more into that. It's an interesting question.
This is just making me think about Yosemite, because when Frederick Law Olmsted laid out the roads in Yosemite, they are very windy on purpose to give people a more picturesque set of a changing set of views. And, you know, some of our photographers in the United States only took pictures of the valley, and then others only took pictures of the train that would get you there. And they're sort of separated into two categories of work, or at least they, even within the same photographer, they often look quite different.
Yeah. I would like to comment a little bit on that because it's interesting the relationship between nature and sort of the technology in Knudsen's work generally. And what we found in the research project was that in the Norwegian 19th century, the fascination for nature and the fascination for new technology went very much hand in hand. So that's very different than today. Because today, at least in Norway, you know, when a new road is being built, immediately there are other people, you know, nature conservationists and so on. You know, there is a polarization. But in 19th century, these two fascinations went very much hand in hand, which is interesting, I think.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Torild. That was lovely. We will now conclude our morning session. So we're so appreciative that you could join us. Let's give another round of applause for Torild and her presentation.
Thank you very much.